Have you ever found yourself wondering why, when faced with the exact same situation, different people respond in completely different ways? Or maybe why a choice that seems absolutely obvious to you might be utterly foreign, even perplexing to someone else? It's not just like individual preference. There's often an invisible, incredibly powerful force shaping our daily decisions. Everything from what we decide to eat for breakfast to, well, how we approach learning something new, and something we often take for granted, really. Today, we're embarking on a truly fascinating deep dive into this very phenomenon. We're exploring the world of cultural identity. We're going to be drawing some brilliant insights from a chapter by Jennifer B. Unger. It's called Cultural Identity and Public Health, and it's from the Handbook of Identity Theory and Research. Now, while the original source material does focus quite a bit on health behaviors, and we'll touch on that, the core principles it lays out, they're universally applicable. They really illuminate human behavior across pretty much every single domain of life, our personal choices, our interactions in society, you name it. So, our mission for you, especially as someone deeply interested in how children learn and develop, is to offer you a powerful shortcut, a way to quickly understand the complex, interwoven dance between who we are culturally and, well, what we choose to do. By the end of this deep dive, you'll gain some practical tools, hopefully, to observe and understand the incredibly diverse identities you'll inevitably encounter in your future classroom. And this could transform how you connect with, relate to, and ultimately teach every single student who walks through your door. Let's start unpacking this essential concept. Okay, so to really get our heads around this, let's start with the basics. When we talk about cultural identity, what exactly are we referring to? It sounds broad, I know, but our source gives us a really precise understanding, right?
That's a great place to start, yeah, because it's a concept often misunderstood. Our source defines cultural identity as an individual's identity as a member of a group with shared characteristics. And crucially, these shared characteristics often, but not always, include things like racial, ethnic, or geographical origins. So right away, we see it's far more expansive than just where your ancestors came from. It's about a deeper sense of belonging. And that leads us to a really important distinction. The source highlights why it emphasizes cultural identity over, say, ethnic identity. Ethnicity generally refers specifically to a person's ancestral geographic origin. Think about it. If someone asks your ethnicity, you might say Irish or Chinese or Nigerian. You're referencing a historical lineage tied to a specific place. But cultures are much broader. As one prominent anthropologist put it, cultures are groups of people who share knowledge, beliefs, norms, and behaviors. This is a vital distinction for us to grasp because it opens up our understanding of identity. It encompasses so much more than just heritage and reveals, well, a richer tapestry of human experience.
Okay, so it's not just about racial or ethnic groups then. That's an important clarification. Could you give us some more concrete examples of these other kinds of cultural groups? What are we talking about when we say broader?
Absolutely. Beyond race or ethnicity, cultural groups can be based on a huge array of shared traits, interests, knowledge, or behaviors. The source specifically offers some compelling examples that help illustrate this breadth. You have gay culture, for instance, which is about shared experiences, history, community. It transcends geographical origin. Then there's deaf culture, which centers around shared language, traditions, and a distinct worldview that shapes how individuals interact with the world. And even something like hip-hop culture, defined by shared music, fashion, language, artistic expression, it unites people globally. What this really emphasizes is that an individual belongs to numerous overlapping and, well, sometimes non-overlapping cultural and subcultural groups simultaneously. Researchers have highlighted this. It isn't about fitting into one neat box. It implies a far more layered, complex, and rich identity for every single person. And this leads us naturally into how these identities actually form and evolve. One researcher described cultural identity as an affiliative construct. What that means, basically, is that individuals actively view themselves and others as belonging to a particular group that shares certain characteristics. It's about a sense of affiliation, right? A bond, a feeling of us that's distinct from them.
Hmm.
So how do people make those judgments about belonging? Well, it's influenced by various factors. A person's physical appearance, for instance, do they physically resemble others in the group they wish to join or belong to? Their ancestral origin plays a role, of course, linking them to a historical community, but also critically, their observable behaviors. This could be something like celebrating certain holidays, their choice of clothing, their preferred music, or even their manner of speech. These are all visible and audible markers of cultural affiliation that signal belonging. There's a helpful framework for understanding cultural identity that describes it as encompassing several key components. First, there's self-identification, simply how you label yourself. Then, a crucial element is a sense of belonging to a cultural group. a deep feeling of being part of something larger than yourself. It also includes your attitudes toward that cultural group, your feelings and opinions about its norms, values, practices. Furthermore, it involves social participation, like actively engaging in community events or rituals, and cultural practices, such as specific traditions, food, art forms. Now, for individuals who are immigrants or belong to minority groups, this framework adds another layer. It includes their subjective orientation not just to their family's cultures of origin, but also to one or more dominant cultures, or even a nuanced combination of these. It's about navigating multiple cultural landscapes, often simultaneously. The reality for many people, especially in our increasingly interconnected and diverse world, is the development of truly multicultural identities. When there are differences between, say, sending and receiving cultures, or even significant diversity within those cultures themselves, people often develop cultural identities that are a rich blend of multiple influences. This phenomenon has been extensively discussed by researchers who highlight the adaptive nature of identity in a globalized world. A fantastic illustrative example comes from a study cited in our source. It looked at nearly 2,000 Hispanic Latino high school students in Southern California. Now, you might initially expect them to identify primarily with Hispanic Latino culture, right? And indeed, a significant majority did. Many also identified with white culture, about a third of them, which makes sense in that context. But here's the really revealing part, underscoring the complexity of identity. A substantial number also identified with African American culture, American Indian culture, and even Asian American culture.
Wow, that's quite a mix.
It is, and it isn't surprising when you consider they're living in a highly diverse urban setting, exposed to a wide variety of norms, expressions, communities. This layered identification even extends to members of historically dominant cultures, adopting elements of minority cultures. Think about non-African American adolescents adopting hip-hop music and clothing styles. It truly shows that identity is a tapestry woven from many threads, not just a single isolated strand.
This truly illustrates a fundamental point then.
Yeah.
Cultural identity isn't some static label you get at birth. It's a living, breathing thing. It's not like a fixed category you just check off on a form once and forget about. What's more, it's something you actively shape, isn't it?
Precisely. Researchers describe identity formation as a continuous and dynamic process. It really does evolve over the entire life course. It adapts and shifts moment to moment based on the social context you find yourself in. It's not a final destination, but a constantly shifting understanding of who you are in relation to others and, in relation to the many groups you engage with. What's even more powerful is the emphasis on the active role of the individual in building their identity. It's not about being passively shaped by a dominant culture. Not at all. Instead, individuals are actively exploring and selecting features from multiple cultures to incorporate into their own self-identity. The specific aspect of your cultural identity that is most salient or prominent and relevant can vary tremendously depending on the situation. For instance, your identity as a student might be most salient in the classroom, but your identity as a member of a specific family or community might be most salient at home or during a cultural celebration.
Or even online, like you mentioned, in a gaming community or something.
Exactly. Online communities are huge now for identity formation and expression.
So for you, listening, as someone preparing to observe and teach students in a classroom, what does this dynamic, multi-layered view of identity actually mean? How does it change how you might approach teaching?
Well, this understanding is foundational, really. It means recognizing that a child's identity isn't fixed, nor is it singular. It's not one thing. Every student who walks into your classroom brings with them multiple layered cultural identities. Beyond their ethnic background, they belong to a family culture, a peer group culture, a neighborhood culture.
And those online communities we just talked about.
Absolutely, like a gamer culture or a YouTube creator culture. And these layers are not just interesting facts, they profoundly influence how these children learn, how they interact with others, and how they perceive themselves and the world around them. It's about seeing the whole evolving child with all their intricate cultural facets, not just one isolated label or aspect of who they are. This perspective is vital for truly responsive teaching. For instance, understanding that a child identifies strongly with a certain online community might give you insights into their preferred communication styles or, learning motivators.
Okay, we've laid the groundwork. We've defined cultural identity, seen how incredibly dynamic it is. But now, the big question. How does this abstract concept actually do something? How does it influence our real-world choices, especially in areas like health, as our source highlights? It can feel a bit theoretical until you see it in action, right?
That's a crucial next step, yeah. This is where the rubber meets the road. Our source makes it clear that cultural identity doesn't directly determine, say, someone's health status. It's not a direct cause, like flipping a switch, but it profoundly influences individuals' decisions about engaging in behaviors that affect their health. Think of it as a powerful lens through which we view the world. Because cultural identity shapes people's fundamental understanding of the physical and social world and their own role within it, it also powerfully shapes their beliefs about health and disease. This includes everything from how they label themselves as healthy or sick, what actions they take to avoid illness, their decisions about seeking early detection for disease, and even when and how they choose to treat an existing illness. An influential researcher noted this decades ago. In the public health field, health-related behaviors are broadly classified into three types, just briefly. First, you have primary prevention. These are behaviors undertaken to maintain health or prevent disease from occurring in the first place. This is like your everyday actions: washing hands, eating well, getting exercise, or making a conscious decision to avoid smoking or excessive alcohol. The goal is simply to stay healthy.
The basics, yeah.
Exactly. Then there's secondary prevention. Here, the goal is to identify and detect disease in its earliest stages, often before symptoms even develop, when it's most likely to be successfully treated. This is where things like regular health screenings come in. Think eye checks, hearing tests, dental checkups, cancer screenings.
Finding things early.
Precisely. And finally, tertiary prevention. This involves treating disease after it has occurred. Here, the focus shifts to managing symptoms, limiting complications, preventing further disability, and improving the overall quality of life for someone living with a condition. And cultural identity, as we'll see, influences decisions across all three of these areas.
The source presents a brilliant theoretical model that helps us visualize this influence. For our listener, you could think of it like a map for understanding human behavior. It doesn't just show us the start and end points. It shows us the actual pathways and the filters along the way. It helps us understand the how.
That's a perfect analogy. The model introduces two core components that are vital for understanding these pathways: mediators and moderators. Mediators. These are the specific steps within a causal pathway. They represent the mechanism by which one phenomenon, in our case, cultural identity, actually influences another, like a health-related behavior. So cultural identity doesn't just jump straight to the behavior. It often works through these mediating factors. They act as a kind of bridge. Then you have moderators. Think of these as enabling or sometimes limiting factors. These are external conditions, like access to healthcare, the availability of accurate information, or simply having the financial resources needed to make a certain choice.
So things outside the person.
Exactly. Moderators can strengthen or block those pathways we talked about. For example, even if your cultural identity strongly motivates you to get a certain health screening, if you don't have access to the screening center or the time off work or the money to pay for it, well, that pathway is blocked regardless of your internal motivation. They are the conditions that allow the influence to happen or prevent it. Now, the driving psychological principle behind this entire model is incredibly insightful and, frankly, resonates deeply across human psychology. People are fundamentally motivated to maintain consistency between their self-image and their behaviors.
Okay, that feels familiar.
It should. This idea isn't new. It's echoed in powerful psychological theories like cognitive dissonance, that discomfort we feel when our beliefs and actions don't align, or self-consistency theory, and self-affirmation theories.
Got it.
These theories all assert that we develop a deep-seated conceptualization of ourselves as individuals, with specific preferences, values, skills, priorities. And we are most comfortable, most at ease, when our actions align with that self-image. When people act in ways that are inconsistent with their self-image, for example, if someone who sees themselves as honest tells a lie, they experience a powerful psychological discomfort. That discomfort is a strong motivator. It drives them to take action to resolve the discrepancy. They might revise their self-image, find a way to rationalize the inconsistent behavior, or simply change the behavior itself. The key takeaway here for our deep dive is that people will strive to engage in behaviors that are consistent with their chosen cultural identities. If a behavior is salient within a group they identify with, or is valued by that group, or strengthens their identity as a member of that group, they are far more likely to embrace and embody it. This desire for consistency is a powerful, often subconscious driver of our actions.
This idea of maintaining consistency with self-image, that seems huge for understanding children too. How can this model help a teacher look past just the surface behavior of a child to understand what's really going on given this underlying psychological drive?
Well, this model provides a really powerful framework for you as a future teacher to understand why students make certain choices or respond in particular ways rather than just focusing on what they do. It's about looking beneath the visible behavior, whether it's how they participate, how they interact with peers, how they approach assignments, to the underlying desire to affirm a cultural identity. For example, a student might be hesitant to ask a question. It might not be because they don't understand. It might be because their cultural self-image values humility and avoiding calling attention to oneself. Or perhaps it values seeking help from family first before asking an outsider, like a teacher.
So it changes the interpretation.
Completely. By using this framework, you develop powerful lenses for observation and empathy. It shifts your perspective from potential judgment, why aren't they participating, to understanding what identity might this child be trying to affirm right now, and how does that influence their actions. It's absolutely critical for effective teaching.
Okay, now we're getting to the really practical part. Our source breaks down 5 specific pathways through which cultural identity influences behavior. These are where the rubber meets the road, and we can see these abstract ideas in action in real-world scenarios. Let's start with pathway 1, the perception of risk of disease among the cultural group.
Yes, this is fascinating. The core concept here is that your cultural identity can profoundly influence whether you perceive yourself or your group as susceptible to a particular outcome, whether that's a disease, a social challenge, or even potentially an academic risk. The source illustrates this with genetic screening among Ashkenazi Jews. There are 2 specific genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2, that are strongly linked to hereditary breast and ovarian cancers. What's critical for this example is that mutations in these genes are especially common among people of Central and Eastern European or Ashkenazi Jewish descent. Because of this elevated risk, screening is typically recommended for Ashkenazi Jewish women, especially those with a family history. Women who test positive might then elect for preventative surgery or more frequent mammograms, potentially life-saving decisions. Now, in recent years, the media has extensively publicized this high prevalence of these genes among Ashkenazi Jews, essentially highlighting this group as being at higher risk for these particular cancers. So for a woman who identifies strongly as an Ashkenazi Jew, that self-identification can significantly increase her subjective perception of her own personal breast cancer risk.
It makes her feel more vulnerable personally.
Exactly. This heightened perception, in turn, naturally makes her more interested in getting tested for these mutations. The cultural identity directly influences the perception of personal vulnerability. But Jewish identity itself is complex, right? It's not just about heritage. It includes religious beliefs, cultural belongingness. These can vary widely. Many people may have a Jewish biological lineage but don't actively participate in the Jewish community or observe its traditions. Others consider themselves members of Jewish culture and community but aren't religiously observant. And due to centuries of migration or historical events, many people with Jewish ancestors aren't even aware of that ancestry. For instance, the source mentions the fascinating discovery of BRCA1 mutations in non-Jewish Americans of Spanish ancestry, who may be descendants of Marranos, Spanish Jews who centuries ago pretended to convert to Catholicism to avoid persecution.
Wow, that's incredible. History reaching down through generations.
It really is. This surprising detail illustrates how hidden ancestry can still be linked to a group's genetic risk, and how a chosen cultural identity, or even the lack of awareness of a cultural identity, can profoundly influence who seeks or is offered screening. It's truly about how your cultural self-perception, whether explicit or implicit, acknowledged or unknown, drives your understanding of risk and thus your behavior.
That is truly striking. What's fascinating here is, well, how a group's shared history and perceived risk can literally influence life or death health decisions, even when that history isn't immediately obvious. The insight is that cultural identity deeply shapes our individual risk radar. But for our listeners in education, this isn't about disease risk, obviously. How does this perception of risk pathway translate to the elementary classroom?
That's a crucial connection to make. If we think about this perception of risk in the context of an elementary classroom, it's not about disease, but how a child's cultural identity might shape their perception of academic or social risk in a learning environment. Imagine, for example, a student who comes from a cultural background where public individual mistakes or, showing off are highly discouraged. In some cultures, such actions might be seen as bringing shame to the family or community, or as a sign of arrogance. Humility might be valued much more highly than individual recognition. Okay, so this child might perceive the risk of answering a question incorrectly in front of their peers as much higher than a child from a culture that emphasizes learning through trial and error or celebrates individual achievement. For them, getting an answer wrong isn't just a learning opportunity, it's a potential social misstep that might reflect poorly on their family or community.
Or make them stand out in a bad way.
Exactly. And similarly, standing out by getting the right answer too quickly or too enthusiastically might also be perceived as a risk, as it could be seen as showing off and separating oneself from the group. This perception of risk, which is deeply rooted in cultural norms about public performance or humility, could lead to a child remaining silent, hesitating to participate, or even actively avoiding engagement, even if the teacher is enthusiastically encouraging everyone to speak up. They might even hesitate to ask for help when struggling, as that might expose a perceived weakness and be a different kind of shame. So for you, as an aspiring educator, understanding this helps you avoid misinterpreting a child's quietness, their reluctance to speak, or even their hesitancy to seek help. It's not necessarily a lack of knowledge, engagement, or defiance.
It could be something else entirely.
Right. It allows for recognizing it as a culturally influenced risk assessment that requires sensitive and thoughtful approaches to participation. You might, for example, offer alternative ways for students to demonstrate understanding, like writing down answers, discussing in smaller, less intimidating groups, or doing one-on-one check-ins rather than always demanding public recitation. This creates a more inclusive environment that respects diverse cultural approaches to learning and participation.
That's incredibly insightful. It's just the entire perspective from what's wrong with this child to what cultural lens are they using.
Yeah.
Let's move to pathway 2. The perception of normative behaviors among the cultural group. This sounds like it's about what's considered normal or acceptable within a particular group.
Precisely. The core concept here is that cultural identity influences our beliefs about which behaviors are considered normal, acceptable, or desirable within a particular group. Cultural norms dictate what's appropriate for different segments of the population, and these can vary significantly across different cultural contexts. The source uses the compelling example of smoking among women to illustrate this powerful influence. Okay, so tobacco smoking is a major public health risk, we all know that, but social norms around it differ drastically across cultures. In many Western cultures, like white American or European cultures, smoking prevalence is often similar for men and women, meaning there aren't strong gendered norms about who should or shouldn't smoke publicly. However, in many traditional Asian cultures, smoking is widely considered appropriate, even a sign of masculinity for men, but it is often highly undesirable and carries significant social stigma for women. It's simply not seen as a feminine or respectable behavior. Now, the influence of cultural identity on smoking behaviors becomes especially salient when Asian women immigrate to or grow up in Western countries. For those who maintain a strong connection to their Asian cultural identity, the norm against women smoking often remains very powerful. It acts as a protective factor, really. Smoking is still taboo.
So their identity protects them in a way.
In that specific context, yes. But for those who adopt more westernized identities, absorbing the norms of their new environment, smoking can become less taboo. And in a surprising twist, for some, it can even become a way to demonstrate that westernized identity, a kind of cultural statement. Data from studies across various U.S. states showed that acculturation to American culture was associated with an increased risk of smoking among Asian women and girls, but not among Asian men and boys. Endorsement of an American cultural identity was linked to higher smoking prevalence, specifically among women, but not men in these studies. This clearly illustrates how an Asian cultural identity can actually be protective against smoking for women, while a westernized cultural identity in this specific context becomes a risk factor for them.
That's a truly striking example. What's so powerful here is how deeply seated cultural norms can literally turn a protective behavior, like not smoking, into a risk factor, depending on which identity you align with. The insight is that our cultural identity serves as a powerful guide for what we consider normal or acceptable behavior for us. Now, how does this translate to the classroom? How do these normative behaviors play out with students?
Oh, this concept translates directly to how students navigate normative behaviors within the classroom. They often bring deeply ingrained cultural norms about interaction, participation, and even learning itself into the school environment. Think about a common classroom activity like group work, or just general classroom participation. In some cultures, particularly collectivist ones, it is highly normative and desirable to help a struggling peer. This can even extend to providing direct answers or doing parts of their work for them because the group's success, unity, and harmony are prioritized above individual achievement.
So helping looks different.
Exactly. This behavior is seen as supportive, collaborative, even an expression of community responsibility. Contrast that with many individualistic Western classroom settings, where there's a strong emphasis on strict individual work and no copying. Extensive peer help, especially providing direct answers, might be considered cheating or undermining the individual learning process. So, a student whose cultural identity emphasizes group harmony might genuinely perceive it as normative and helpful to assist a struggling peer in a way that, to them, feels natural and supportive, even if the explicit classroom rule is individual effort.
They're not trying to break rules, they're following different ones.
Precisely. They are simply adhering to a different, deeply ingrained cultural norm about collective responsibility and mutual support. Another example. A child from a culture that values quiet, attentive listening might seem disengaged to a teacher who expects active, verbal participation because their cultural norm for showing engagement is different. So for you, as a teacher, understanding these differing cultural normative behaviors is incredibly valuable. What might appear to be non-compliance, a lack of understanding of the rules, or even a lack of engagement, could actually be a student adhering to a different, deeply ingrained cultural norm. This insight allows you to be much more effective. Instead of immediately correcting a child for copying or being too quiet, you could explicitly teach classroom norms. Maybe even discuss why certain norms are in place, for example, explaining that individual work helps each person build their own understanding, or that speaking up helps everyone learn from different perspectives. This helps bridge the gap between their cultural understanding and the classroom's expectations, fostering mutual respect and effective learning.
That's a powerful point, showing how an educator's understanding can prevent misinterpretations. That brings us to pathway 3, the desire to self-present as a member of a cultural group. This sounds like it's about signaling who you are through your actions and choices.
It absolutely is. The core concept here is that people may choose to adopt specific behaviors as a way of demonstrating their cultural identity to others, often consciously or, subconsciously. If a certain behavior is widely viewed as typical of a group they want to belong to or a group they admire, engaging in that behavior becomes a form of self-presentation. It's a way of signaling, I am one of them. The source offers a compelling and somewhat complex example with menthol smoking among African Americans. Okay, so data shows over 70% of African American smokers prefer menthol cigarettes, compared to about 30% of white smokers. This isn't random. It has deep historical and cultural roots. The association between African American cultural identity and menthol smoking likely began in traditional deep South African American culture, where mentholated products were commonly used as folk medicine for various ailments. This led to a general familiarity and acceptance. Unfortunately, the tobacco industry capitalized on this existing cultural familiarity. They aggressively marketed menthol cigarettes specifically to this community.
Oh, really?
They marketed them as healthier, young, hip, new, and overtly African-Americanized. Brands like Kool selectively advertised in African-American neighborhoods and magazines, using imagery and associations with popular African-American music genres like jazz and hip-hop. This relentless marketing campaign effectively created a strong cultural norm and a powerful cultural image. African Americans smoke menthols. It wasn't organic, it was engineered. Now, with this norm and image firmly established, it influences individual behavior. Many African Americans might first try menthol cigarettes because their parents, relatives, or community members smoke them. Depending on how strongly they identify with the African American community and its, media-generated image, they might continue smoking menthols to reinforce that identity. Research confirms this. A study cited in our source found that African American menthol smokers had stronger ethnic self-identification, stronger beliefs that menthol smoking was consistent with the African American image, and stronger beliefs that it was an African American tradition compared to non-menthol smokers.
So the marketing worked, essentially creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
In many ways, yes. It's a powerful, self-perpetuating cycle. Ironically, the association is even shifting in unexpected ways. The source mentions reports of some whites who wish to emulate African American culture also smoking menthol cigarettes. This perfectly illustrates that cultural identities aren't always tied to your biological background. They can be adopted through shared interests and aspirations. And those adopted identities can powerfully influence behavior, even in potentially harmful ways. This example truly shows how external forces, like industry marketing, can skillfully create a cultural image around a product or behavior that people then internalize and express through their choices, even when those choices involve harmful health behaviors.
That's a truly unsettling revelation, how external forces like industry marketing can literally create a cultural image that people then internalize and express through their choices, even with harmful health behaviors. The insight here is that we use our actions as symbols, actively curating our identity for ourselves and for others. So how does this play out in the classroom? How do children self-present their cultural identity through their daily choices?
Oh, children are constantly exploring their identities and demonstrating who they are or who they want to be. And this applies to so many daily choices in a classroom environment, well beyond just health behaviors. Think about it. Observe how children express their identities through choices in clothing, specific hairstyles, their preferred toys or characters on their backpacks or lunchboxes, or even the slang they use with their friends.
The little things add up.
They really do. A child might choose to wear specific brands of sneakers, a particular type of hair accessory, or reference certain online trends or video game characters because it's associated with a cultural group they identify with. This could be a specific peer subculture in the school, or it could be a broader ethnic group's fashion or a specific pop culture trend. For example, a student might intentionally wear a sports jersey of a specific team, not just because they like the team, but because it connects them to a sports culture within their peer group or family, affirming that aspect of their identity. During recess, for another example, children often gravitate towards specific games or social groups to reinforce their belonging. They might join a group that is deeply immersed in what we could call a gamer culture, if they identify with that, discussing game strategies and characters. Or they might participate in a sports culture by playing a specific sport, using certain jargon. Or they might engage in traditional forms of play passed down through a family's cultural tradition. These are all conscious or subconscious efforts to affirm, this is who I am, and these are my people. You might see a group of children consistently using a specific phrase they picked up from a popular video, which serves as an inside joke and a marker of their shared identity as fans of that content. So for you as an educator, recognizing these self-presentation efforts can help you understand underlying social dynamics and peer influence in your classroom. It allows you to move beyond simply seeing these expressions as fleeting fads or superficial choices. Instead, you see them as meaningful attempts at identity affirmation.
Seeing the why behind the what.
Exactly. This understanding presents an incredible opportunity to acknowledge and celebrate the diverse ways children express who they are, fostering a more inclusive and understanding classroom environment where every child feels seen and valued for their unique cultural tapestry. You might even leverage these interests to make learning more relatable, for instance, by connecting a math problem to a popular video game or a historical event to a character they admire.
That's a really good way to put it. Seeing these expressions as meaningful attempts at identity affirmation. Fascinating. Now for Pathway 4, the functional meaning of the behavior in the culture. This one really zeroes in on how the purpose or meaning of an action can be totally different depending on your cultural lens.
This is a profound pathway because it reveals that an action isn't universal. Its inherent functional meaning can vary dramatically across cultures. And this, in turn, influences whether and how it is practiced. Our source uses the very clear example of individual versus family-based medical decision-making. Okay, so in the United States and most Western cultures, there's a strong emphasis on personal autonomy in healthcare. Patients are typically given all the relevant medical information, and they are expected to make the final decisions about their treatment.
The patient decides.
Right. This is viewed as a fundamental right, a way for the patient to maintain control, dignity, and privacy. This perspective reflects what's called an independent self-control. The self is seen as a distinct, self-contained entity with its own inherent boundaries, rights, and responsibilities. The individual is the primary decision maker. However, in many collectivist cultures, including numerous cultures in Asia and Latin America, medical decision-making is viewed very differently. It's often seen as a collective family activity.
The whole family gets involved.
Often, yes. It's seen as an opportunity for family members to collectively help the patient by relieving them of the burden of making difficult choices alone. This reflects an interdependent self-control. Here, the self is fundamentally connected to and defined by the family and community. Prioritizing group goals and relationships is paramount, and individual autonomy might be secondary to collective harmony or well-being. The family might designate one member, often not even the patient themselves, to receive medical information and convey the family's collective decision back to the physician. Often the patient isn't even told all the details of their prognosis because the family believes bad news might cause excessive worry or stress, which could impede recovery.
So the function of protecting the patient is achieved differently.
Exactly. From this perspective, personal autonomy isn't necessarily seen as a right, but potentially a burden that the family collectively shoulders. Research has shown that individuals of Korean and Mexican descent, for example, were more likely to prefer this family-centered model, while European American and African American respondents typically preferred patient-centered decision-making.
So what does this all mean? The very meaning of an action, like making a medical choice, changes completely based on your cultural lens and how you view the self as independent or interdependent. The insight here is that the function of a behavior is culturally assigned. How does this independent versus interdependent self-construal play out for our listener in an elementary school setting, maybe with something like homework or parent communication?
Oh, this distinction between independent and interdependent self-construal is absolutely fundamental for understanding how children and their families interact with school processes and expectations. It can explain so much about what might otherwise seem like confusing or uncooperative behaviors. Consider homework. If a family comes from a culture with a strong interdependent self-control, they might view homework not just as the child's individual task, but as a collective family responsibility.
A family project almost.
Kind of, yeah. In this context, everyone pitches in to help the child succeed. Parents might see it as their duty to be actively involved, providing direct assistance, explaining concepts, or even helping complete parts of the assignment because the child's success is seen as the family's success. It's a shared endeavor. Conversely, if a family comes from a culture emphasizing independent self-control, they might expect the child to complete homework entirely alone. They see it as a test of the child's individual capability, autonomy, and independence. Intervening too much might be seen as hindering that development or even cheating. Similarly, think about a parent-teacher conference. A family with an interdependent view might expect or bring multiple family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles, even close fictive kin, those cherished friends who are like family to attend.
The whole support network shows up.
Exactly. They view the child's education as a collective family concern that requires a group discussion and decision-making process, seeking broad consensus. On the other hand, a family with an independent view might expect only one parent to attend, maybe just the mother or father, focusing solely on the individual child's progress and expecting a private one-on-one discussion with the teacher. What seems like lack of engagement from one perspective, or perhaps too much involvement from another, might just be rooted in a different cultural lens about the function of family involvement. So, for you as a teacher, understanding these different functional meanings of school-related behaviors can help you bridge cultural gaps and tailor your communication. It helps you avoid misunderstandings about parental engagement or student independence. For instance, you might proactively clarify expectations for homework completion, acknowledging that different families have different traditions for supporting their children, and suggest ways they can help that align with classroom goals, like discussing ideas without directly doing the work for the student. Or, for parent-teacher conferences, you could explicitly state that all family members who wish to support the student are welcome, or offer flexible meeting options, respecting various cultural approaches to family involvement.
That's incredibly powerful guidance. And it leads us to our final pathway. Pathway 5. Cultural values. This sounds like the deepest layer of all, the guiding principles.
It is indeed. The core concept here is that cultural values are essentially the fundamental attitudes, the deeply held beliefs, the core priorities, and the encouraged behaviors that are emphasized and revered by members of a particular social group. These values deeply shape individuals' attitudes toward performing various behaviors. They act as a kind of moral compass that guides daily actions. Now, while many cultures share universal values like kindness or honesty, the nuances and priorities differ significantly. The source highlights some beautiful examples. Many cultures value harmonious social relationships, politeness, and avoiding blatant disagreement to preserve social cohesion. Think about simpatia, a traditionally Hispanic value emphasizing agreeableness, maintaining pleasant social interactions, and avoiding direct confrontation. Or the traditionally Asian value of saving face, which involves preserving one's own dignity and avoiding embarrassment for oneself or others in public, often prioritizing indirect communication to maintain harmony. Some cultures also strongly endorse collectivist values, prioritizing the well-being and cohesion of the group, whether that's the immediate family, the extended community, or the broader society over the individual's well-being or desires. Familism, a traditionally Hispanic value, is a great example. It emphasizes a strong sense of obligation and connectedness to immediate and extended family, and even those fictive kin we mentioned, close family friends who are treated just like relatives.
Part of the family fabric.
Exactly. These bonds often come with a sense of duty and reciprocal support. Other values imply a more vertical or hierarchical power structure within society. This often means that lower status individuals, like children, are expected to obey and show profound respect for higher status individuals, such as family and community elders, teachers, doctors, religious leaders, often for the good of the larger group or to maintain social order. Examples include respeto, a traditionally Hispanic value emphasizing deep respect for elders and authority figures, often expressed through deference and politeness. Another is filial piety, a traditionally Asian value that highlights a child's profound duty to show respect, care for, and obey their parents and other authority figures throughout their lives, often prioritizing their parents' needs above their own. And research actually links these internalized values to concrete behaviors. For instance, a study of culturally diverse high school students found that filial piety was associated with lower substance use in adolescence.
Why was that?
Presumably because students who deeply internalized this value were more likely to obey their parents' rules about avoiding drugs and alcohol. Another study found that values like respect for adults and politeness were inversely associated with tobacco use in Asian American and Hispanic middle school students. This clearly demonstrates how cultural identity shapes these values, which in turn affect choices, leading to profound impacts on health and well-being.
That's incredibly illuminating. What's so powerful here is how deeply ingrained values, passed down through generations, can shape the choices young people make, whether about health or even how they behave in a classroom. The insight is that our core values aren't just personal, they are profoundly cultural and drive so much of our interaction. So how do these cultural values specifically play out in teacher-student interactions and adherence to rules in an elementary school?
This is perhaps one of the most direct and impactful areas for elementary educators, yeah. Because cultural values directly shape classroom behavior and the very expectations for interaction. Let's take respeto again as an example. Imagine a student, let's call her Elena, who comes from a family where respeto, that profound respect for elders and authority figures, is a cornerstone value. When you, as her teacher, look directly at her to encourage participation, Elena might instinctively lower her gaze or avoid prolonged eye contact.
Which might seem like she's not paying attention.
Right. But it isn't because she's disengaged or disrespects you. On the contrary, in her cultural understanding, direct, prolonged eye contact with an authority figure might be seen as challenging, confrontational, or even impolite. She is acting in accordance with a deeply held cultural value of showing deference. Similarly, if you invite questions with a phrase like, "Don't be afraid to challenge my ideas," Elena might hesitate. She's not lacking critical thinking. She's simply navigating a cultural norm where directly questioning an adult, especially an authority figure like a teacher, is not how respect is typically shown. Consider another example with filial piety. A student whose family emphasizes this value might feel a strong, inherent obligation to obey their parents' rules about things like screen time, bedtime, or homework completion, especially if those rules are presented as parental expectations for their well-being. This strong internal drive to honor their parents' wishes could significantly impact their energy levels or preparedness for school the next day. They may prioritize what they perceive as their family duty over other external pressures or even their own individual preferences, even if it means sacrificing some sleep or recreational time.
So what you see as tiredness could actually be them fulfilling a cultural obligation at home.
It could be, yes. What a teacher sees as tiredness or incomplete homework could be a manifestation of this profound cultural value, not a lack of effort or defiance. This also applies to things like politeness in conflict. A child from a culture that values harmonious social relationships and avoiding direct disagreement might seem passive or unwilling to stand up for themselves when dealing with a peer conflict, preferring to diffuse the situation or seek adult mediation rather than direct confrontation. So for you, understanding the diverse cultural values students bring into your classroom, it's not about memorizing every cultural norm, that's impossible. It's about fostering a truly inclusive and effective learning environment. This understanding allows for proactive strategies to balance cultural values with classroom expectations. For example, if you notice a student avoiding eye contact, you might explicitly explain why certain interactions are encouraged in your classroom. In our classroom, looking at me helps me know you're listening and helps us connect. But I also understand some families teach different ways of showing respect, and I appreciate whatever way you choose to show it.
Acknowledging the difference respectfully.
Exactly. Or, we challenge ideas here to learn and grow, not to disrespect anyone. It's how we build better ideas together. This kind of direct, respectful communication can bridge cultural gaps and prevent misunderstandings, making your classroom a place where every child feels both understood and successful.
We've really taken a comprehensive journey through these 5 pathways, seeing how profoundly cultural identity influences our choices and behaviors. But of course, cultural identity isn't the only thing shaping us, is it? Our source briefly touches on other influencing factors that layer into this complexity.
That's a crucial point to remember, yeah. While cultural identity is incredibly influential and provides a powerful lens, it's not the only factor determining behavior. Our source reminds us that other predisposing factors also play a significant role, often interacting with cultural identity. These include broad demographics, like a person's age. Different age groups have different social norms, gender, which can influence cultural expectations, and socioeconomic status, which impacts resources and opportunities. Then there's personality. Some people just have a general tendency to take more risks or be more introverted, as researchers have discussed.
Nature and nurture interacting.
Pretty much. Individual knowledge also matters. Do you know the risks and benefits? Do you know how to perform a task correctly? Self-efficacy. Your confidence in your ability to successfully perform a particular behavior that's vital too, as one influential theorist highlighted. And finally, actual skills. Do you have the ability to perform a behavior correctly and consistently? All these factors interweave with cultural identity to shape our actions in intricate ways.
So cultural identity provides us with a profoundly significant and often overlooked lens to understand human behavior that might otherwise seem opaque. It's a foundational piece of the puzzle, even if not the whole puzzle.
Absolutely. And to fully appreciate this, we need to reiterate the broader context. All human behavior occurs within what one prominent developmental psychologist called a sociocultural ecosystem. This means that systems outside the individual, their immediate family, wider social networks, social institutions like schools, workplaces, churches, their local community, even the larger sociopolitical context, all exert continuous influences on behavior.
It's all connected.
It really is.
Yeah.
This is particularly relevant for you in education because it means the classroom itself is not an isolated bubble. It's a microcultural context, constantly interacting with and being shaped by your students' broader external cultural identities. For example, school policies on discipline or language might clash with or support a child's family cultural norms, creating a dynamic interplay right there in your school.
So, with all this in mind, what does this all mean for someone like you, listening, stepping into the exciting, diverse world of elementary education? Our source provides crucial recommendations for researchers and practitioners that seem incredibly relevant for your future practice, bringing this all together.
Indeed. The source identifies several key areas for future focus, which directly translate into practical takeaways for you. First, it emphasizes the need for improved measures of cultural identity in research. For researchers, this means developing better, more nuanced ways to define and assess things like acculturation and ethnic identity, moving beyond simple checklists. For you, as a teacher, this translates to recognizing the sheer complexity of identity in each child. It's a call to avoid oversimplification or relying on stereotypes based on a name or appearance.
Don't just tick a box.
Exactly. You need to engage with the unique, multifaceted cultural tapestry of each student, understanding that their identity is probably more complex than you initially perceive. Second, the source highlights the need for research into how changes in cultural identity affect behavior, both long-term and short-term. For a teacher, this means recognizing that students' identities are not static, they are incredibly dynamic. Children are constantly evolving, exploring, shaping their identities, sometimes through acculturation to a new school environment, sometimes through new friendships, new social groups, exposure to new ideas online.
Kids change fast.
They do. And as their identities shift, so too might their classroom behaviors, preferences, ways of interacting. This calls for flexibility, ongoing observation on your part, and a willingness to understand that a child's behavior might change as their identity evolves. Third, it recommends research on the interactions between an individual's cultural identity and the larger cultural context. This involves exploring questions like, does cultural identity influence behavior more when an individual is in a cultural minority within a classroom? Perhaps because their identity becomes more salient, or they feel a greater need to affirm it, or when they are in the cultural majority and prevailing social norms reinforce their behavior. This helps teachers consider the social dynamics and peer groups within their classroom and how a student's sense of belonging might be impacted. It guides you to create an environment where all identities feel affirmed, whether a child is one of many or the only one from a specific cultural background. Finally, and perhaps most directly impactful for you, the source strongly emphasizes that practitioners, whether doctors or, in your case, teachers, should understand patients' or students' cultural identities and present advice or instruction in ways that are compatible with those identities.
Making it relevant and respectful.
Precisely. This isn't about becoming an expert in every single culture, which is an impossible task. It's about recognizing the importance of culture as a shaping force in human behavior. The source provides a perfect example of this in action. Two researchers described a case of a Chinese man with a serious medical condition. The physician, rather than assuming a Western individualistic approach, simply asked the man. He asked if he preferred to make his medical decisions himself or if he preferred a family member to receive the information and convey the family's decision.
Just asked.
Just asked. The man, respecting his cultural values regarding family involvement, designated his son. And it was a solution that was acceptable and effective for everyone involved. This simple act of inquiry and respect made all the difference.
That really underlines the profound importance of simply asking and listening, doesn't it? It's not about having all the answers or being an expert in every culture, but about recognizing the importance of culture itself as a shaping force. And then being open, curious, and respectful in your approach. It empowers you to truly connect. We've taken a comprehensive deep dive today into how cultural identity, in all its complexity, shapes human behavior. We've explored it through fascinating pathways like the perception of risk, the powerful influence of normative behaviors, the desire for self-presentation, the varying functional meanings we ascribe to actions, and those deeply ingrained cultural values. This isn't just academic theory, it's a profound lens for understanding every interaction, every choice, and every individual you'll meet.
That's right. Understanding and respecting cultural values and acknowledging the dynamic and layered nature of identity. It isn't just about being nice or inclusive, though those are certainly important outcomes. It's about fundamentally improving understanding, communication, and ultimately effectiveness. Whether you're working in public health or, crucially, in education, this understanding will empower you to connect more deeply, teach more effectively, and foster truly supportive environments.
So as you step into the classroom, consider this. Every student who walks through your door carries with them not just a name and a backpack, but an intricate, dynamic tapestry of cultural identities. These identities profoundly shape how they learn, interact, and perceive the world around them. How will understanding those unique tapestries transform the way you teach, connect, and inspire, creating a truly responsive and effective learning environment for every single child? We encourage you to observe your own cultural identities and those around you with fresh eyes, seeing the subtle yet powerful ways these deep-seated influences play out in daily life.